Hello, my name is Genevieve Rantisi, and my film is called Unstoppable. Unstoppable is directed by Tony Scott, and it stars Denzel Washington and Chris Pine. And it's about a runaway train carrying a cargo of toxic chemicals, and they're chasing the runaway train in a separate locomotive and need to bring it under control before it derails a curve and causes a toxic spill that will decimate a town. So the extract I chose is between 1 hour 19 minutes 0 seconds and to 1:24 minutes 0 seconds. This part of the extract is the climax of the movie because Will and Frank must slow the train down before it derails a curve. So Frank tries to jump carts, but the gap was too big to jump. So as the train encounters the curve, some material falls off, but the train passes the curve without derailing. The train is going about 70 miles per hour. Many news reporters and people are watching. Then Nedney, he's a worker and at the train headquarters, and he shows up and Will jumps in the back of his truck. So I selected this extract because it is a climax, and that is where the film's theme is shown. The extract is very fun to watch, and it relates to the rest of the film narrative because the use of cinematography is used well, and it shows how lighting and sound is used, and like the scene kind of shows how the whole film is as a whole. My view of the director's intent is that he wanted to make the movie realistic. For example, in the extract, Frank was jumping between carts while the train was moving, and that was real. And in an interview, Scott said that he wanted Frank to be actually on top of the train while it's moving, and he trained the actors. He also wanted to show the train was the beast, and he wanted to seem dangerous. Like, for example, when the train encounters a curve, the audience was on the edge of their seats, and Scott wanted the audience to feel that emotion. The color blue is seen a lot and is seen as a high color temperature. This color gives a sad tone. Like in the extract, when the camera had a close-up on Will's face, the color was blue, and it kind of represents a sadness, and it relates to the whole film because earlier in the film, Will and Frank had fights with their families, and that represents sadness. The weather was a cloudy day, and cloudy days create slow fall-offs and transparent shadows. The gloomy color represents a bad day, and you could see that because Will had a fight with his daughter. Frank had a fight with his daughters, and Will just had problems with his wife. And the color of the train is red, and it represents dangerous, and it ties back to the idea where Scott wanted to make the movie seem dangerous. And the editing gave the film more tension since it was fast-paced cutting. The cinematography emphasized on the action and the emotion of Will and Frank. For example, in the extract, there's a close-up of Will and Frank's faces, and when they spoke, it would move to an extreme close-up. This creates meaning because it shows that the extreme close-up shots shows the emotion or tension of the actors conveying. And what we can see from that, because Will and Frank have a lot on their mind since they have their problems with their own families, and they're trying to stop this train from decimating a town. When the action got more intense, like when the train was passing the curve, the camera movement was very jerky, and there was a lot of panning and tracking shots. The use of low angles shots makes the train look like a beast, and that was intended by Scott. Scott's other films like The Hunger and Man on Fire had good cinematography and were based on real events. And it kind of ties back to this movie because the cinematography determined the genre of action because of the uses of different angles are used to show the action. The fast cutting also determines the genre because the audience sees fast cuts of the action. Panning shots were used to show the train's length, and there was also lots of tracking shots because it lets the audience see beyond the train, so we see more setting and we see more places with that. There was a lot of non-synchronous sound, and in the extract there's a low angle shot of the train, and the audience hears the sounds of the rail of the train, and the music showed a sense of mystery and sadness. For example, when the train was passing the curve, the music is in the background and the sound was heard louder than the train sounds, and the sound heard was louder, so the train sound was louder than the background music, and this means that the director wants the train to be the center of attention, and he emphasized the train is more important. That's why the sound of the train is really loud. The loudness of the train represents Scott's idea, which is that he wanted to show that the train is a beast. The background music is non-diegetic and the train sounds are diegetic. I think the train sounds are diegetic because it represents the train, because usually trains are known for their their sounds and everything. In the beginning of the movie, there were lots of open forms. The only parts that were closed forms are when Will and Frank were talking about their problems in the train. The rest of the movie was open form. For example, in the extract, as the train encountered the curve, the audience sees different angles. There are also shots of Will and Frank and news reporters and spectators watching the train. The territorial design was mostly the train's paths. The design of the headquarters is nice and has the color of blue, and this could again represent sadness because the people there try to help Will and Frank control the train. Throughout the whole film, Will and Frank didn't have lots of dialogue. They communicated in a couple of words, like in the extract. Will and Frank are communicating with each other while the train is on the curve, and little dialogue is spoken between them. And as they were talking, the audience could feel the tension because they were talking with each other in a loud voice. And I think Scott had little spoken dialogue to make the film seem so realistic. The setting of this movie represents a lot of symbolism. Since the train has many paths to go, Will and Frank are heading in the wrong path. Earlier in the film, Will had problems with his wife, and Frank forgot his daughter's birthday, and his daughter is mad at him. The train's path represents the wrong or dangerous path, since it's not controlled and it could kill lots of people if it derails. So Will and Frank are following the train's path, and they are trying to control the train, but what they really are trying to do is control their lives, because Will wants to reunite with his wife and son, and Frank wants to get his job back since he's been laid off and wants to make things right with his daughters. And when they stop the train, they will control the train and control their lives. And the location was a gloomy day, and that represents a bad day or represents sadness. There were special effects to make the action more realistic. When like for example, in the extract, when there was sparks of fire from the bottom of the train, this gives the train a realistic look. The sparks make the train look like it's going really fast. The historical factors are that this film is based on a historic event that happened in May 16, 2001 in Ohio. A runaway freight train with no one aboard contained hazardous materials. Scott wanted to make this event into a film, and he wanted to show that this real event affected the people involved in this event. Economical factors are connected to today's factors, like the film is aware of the recession and the insecurity and resentment among older workers and how newcomers want to take their jobs. Like in the beginning of the movie, Frank was laid off and Will came in as a new worker. Social factors are about families. Will and Frank had problems with their families, and it was fueled by the recession. And I think there's a little racism involved in here because Frank jumps between the carts to try to get to the main cart to control the train, but he couldn't jump between the carts, and Will jumped into the truck and he jumped back onto the train and stopped the train. And I think it's racist because in a way the white man becomes the hero. Some political factors about this movie is that there's just thousands of tons of iron and fuel and combustible toxic chemicals barreling like a rocket, and it kind of shows the Pennsylvania industry. There is a symbol of family. Since Will and Frank had issues with family before going to work, their families never suspected that something will go bad today with their loved one. Like, for example, in the extract, Will and Frank are in the train as it's on the curve, and we see Will's wife and son come to the scene, and they're terrified because Will is on a dangerous train, and Frank are watching the news channel while they're at work, and to make sure their father's okay. The genre of this movie is an action, drama, and suspense movie, but mostly action and suspense. This is an action movie because throughout the whole movie, Frank and Will try to chase and stop the runaway train. And it's a suspense genre because the audience is always on their feet because they don't know if Will and Frank will stop the train in time before it decimates a town. Like, for example, in the extract, we see Will and Frank's family really scared because their loved ones are in the train. The cinematography determines the genre of the action because there's a variety of different angles, and the cinematography would be shaky when there's a lot of action. The fast cutting, there's also lots of fast cutting. Like, example, when the train was going past the curve, there was lots of tracking shots, panning shots, low angle shots, and they were all fast paced. The information that's conveyed through the filmmaking process is the thought of the people that were affected by the real historical event. The filmmakers had to take in the consideration of the people in Ohio that were affected by the runaway train. In the extract, Will and Frank's families were affected because their loved ones were trying to stop a dangerous train.